he has insight into future morality. Why doesn't Whitman use Emerson as the poster boy for transcendentalism? Offends way too many people. You can't have a homosexuality representing transcendentalism. That's one of the reasons why Emerson distances himself so quickly and so forcefully from Whitman when Whitman tries to tie himself to Emerson by putting that quote from Emerson in at the beginning of Leaves of Grass. Now, Emily Dickinson is another one who can certainly qualify as a transcendental hero. She probably thing is talked about the most when it comes to Emily Dickinson is the fact that in her relatively early 20s she starts to withdraw from the world. And before long, at first she doesn't leave Amherst, then she doesn't leave her garden, then she doesn't leave her house, and then she doesn't see people coming in. There are a number of different possible explanations for that. For a long time, it was popular to treat Emily Dickinson as a very neurotic woman, preoccupied with death, withdrawing from the world because of mental illness. It's not necessarily the case. There are a number of alternative explanations for that, for her withdrawal. She seems to lead a normal childhood. She has a lot of friends. She's cute. She's popular. She's very bright. Somewhere around 12 or 13, I think it is, her best friend dies, who's also 12 or 13. And Emily gets sick. And this may provide one of the explanations for the relationship between her and her father, which is sometimes seen as the motivation for Emily's withdrawal. It is a strange relationship for the time. Emily basically runs the house well before her mother gets sick. Her mother wasn't, well, she may have been competent, but her father is a senator and the treasurer of the local college, a lawyer, the richest man in town, a guy who's used to having his own way. And his wife just can't get things right as far as he's concerned, but Emily can. So Emily runs the household from her teen years on. Now, I don't think there's much ground for it at all, and I know there's no documentary evidence behind it, but as part of the current tendency to try to turn everybody into a victim, some people have interpreted the relationship between Emily and her father as an incestuous one. And that Emily's withdrawal from the world is, a lot of times incest victims blame themselves, and that Emily withdrew from the world with a neurotic kind of shame, and it was really because of the relations with her father. And that was why she was put in charge of the house. It may simply have been that Emily was the favorite daughter, and everybody else had trouble with the old man, but she could pretty much twist him around her finger. There are some oddities which point, though, to a far more palatable explanation. For example, her father would give her books and then ask her not to read them. That sounds like the ultimate control freak. You know, it's like putting a biscuit on the dog's nose and not letting it have it until you tell him so. But it may have been that they were worried when Emily got sick because her friend died. She got so upset that she got sick and almost died herself. Well, you almost lose a child, you don't forget it. It comes to dominate your life. And it may have been that although his father admired her mind because she was obviously really bright and wanted to encourage her to expand her mind, he was afraid that if he gave her a book and it had something in it that upset her, she'd get sick again and they'd lose her. So it might not have been domination at all on his part. It might have just been an excess of concern from parents who have almost lost a child. The idea that he dominated her life doesn't hold much water either. I mean, people see him as this kind of an ogre, and he was stern, but 19th century fathers were all pretty stern. The father was the head of the household. His word went. And then a guy who's as powerful in society as he is, that wouldn't be unexpected. But she's not really dominated by him, and there are a number of instances that seem to indicate that. For example, She goes away to Mount Holyoke Academy, which was a finishing school for girls, not quite a college. Generally, they learned drawing, and they learned music, and they learned a little bit of mathematics. Basically, it was stuff to make them more attractive to men, sort of like a home entertainment system. She sings, she dances, she plays the piano, and has other talents, and can run a household. When she's there, the school is run by a fanatical Christian as the headmistress, who wants everybody to get up publicly and declare their life for Christ. At the beginning of the semester, nobody's done it. End of the semester, everybody's done it but one person. Guess who it is? Emily Dickinson. And her friends are saying to her, you don't have to mean it, just get up and say it, everybody will get off you. Emily won't do it. One group says her father made her quit and come home and take care of the house because it wasn't run right and he wasn't getting his toast. His toast was burned half the time. And he wanted things done right and only Emily could do it. Emily didn't want to go back. She really loved the family and didn't like being away that much. But if she had been dominated by Edward Dickinson, she would have joined the church he belonged to. He was the deacon in the church. Remember, everybody belonged to a church then? It's a humiliation for a guy who's a major officer in the church that his kid won't join the church. I mean, her brother joined, her sister joined. Emily couldn't do it. Emily's a lot like Anne Bradstreet in that she has a faith, but it doesn't come easily to her, as is generally the case with people who are largely intellectually oriented. They see the flaws in the arguments, and it's hard to make that leap of faith because you've got to disregard logic and reason, and generally they're not able to do it. So Emily sometimes seems to say there is a God, there is a life after death, and other times she seems to say exactly the opposite. So she struggles for that faith all the way through. Now the fact that she won't join the church, even though she knows it's embarrassing to her father, is a pretty good indication that she stood up to him, that she wasn't intimidated by him. We also have a note from her when she's 16. She says, "Mother and father are sitting in state," like they're the king and queen, "in the parlor, perusing the newspaper to make sure there's nothing obscene in there so I can read it." So she's making fun of them. I mean, if you can make fun of people, you're certainly not intimidated by them. One of the explanations for her withdrawal from the world, well, let me give you the transcendental one right off the bat. Emily may have withdrawn from the world to become an artist. She makes a deal with her father, and you didn't generally negotiate with your father in those days, even if you were male, that she gets 2 hours a day to write poetry and nobody is to disturb her up in that little garret room. And if Edward Dickinson wants his tea, he's out of luck until Emily is finished with her poetry. She may have withdrawn to devote her life to being an artist. Because she wants to be an artist, she's not interested in being a commercial success. She withdraws from the world because when you're a poet, you can't schedule poems. They just show up. And when they show up, you've got to get to work on them or you lose them. Now it takes a really strong person when their friends are over visiting to say, "I have to go write a poem now. Stay here and finish your tea and crumpets, but I'm gone." Even as a daughter, Emily wouldn't have normally been able to do that until she makes that withdrawal from the world. She doesn't marry. She was cute looking, small, petite, vivacious in a kind of frenetic way. She could have gotten married, certainly. In fact, Judge Otis P. Lord, one of the big puzzles for scholarship when it comes to Emily Dickinson is, did Emily Dickinson have an affair with a married man, and if so, who was he? Because a lot of her poems, as you'll see, seem to hint about that. One of them is Judge Otis P. Lord, a contemporary of her father's, who, when Emily is around 50, his wife finally dies. Remember, if you meet your true love and you're married, you stick with your marriage. Very shortly after she dies, he comes to Emily and asks her to marry him. Now that didn't happen overnight. There had to be some connection there for quite a long time. Judge Lord visited Emily every day. But she won't marry him even then. Now normally if you were 50 years old, no matter who asked you to marry them, you would probably have jumped at the chance if you had never been married. And Emily turns it down. She says basically, I've lived my own life too long to move into some man's house and live by some man's rules. She won't make the compromise. That of course makes her look a lot like Thoreau. By withdrawing from the world, she doesn't have to marry. Well, why can't she be married and be a poet? You get married in those days, what almost always follows? Kids. Now sure, there are a lot of modern poets, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, that had children and still were great poets. But in Emily's day, you had to run a household. There was more time had to be devoted to taking care of kids and to running a house than does now. And while a spinster might spend her time writing poetry and nobody get very upset about it, a mother who's spending her time writing poetry would be seen as taking that time away from her children. So she doesn't marry, she doesn't have children, she can spend all of her time writing poetry. In other words, this might not have been a neurotic withdrawal from the world. This may have been an intentional retreat in order to carry out her art. If she got married, her father's the richest man in town, she would have married somebody like Otis P. Lord. Well, if she did, in addition to having children, there would have been a social life. Women visited each other. They had a day when important women were at home. And who had to visit who and who got to stay home had to do with what your status was in the community. And who you could visit, who would let you in, and who would tell the maid to tell you they were out, had a lot to do with your status in the community. So all remember that social climbing is an important thing, especially in small towns. She would have had to spend one day entertaining other people and probably 2 days as the wife of some prominent man going out and visiting other people. Well, you can't have the important ladies, the banker's wife and the editor's wife over for tea and right in a minute go, oh, poem coming up, I'm out of here, and just leave them sitting there. So she doesn't have to do that. In fact, she withdraws so much from the world that nobody sees her. When people come to visit, Emily sits in another room and slips little notes under the door for her part of the conversation. Or she sits upstairs and listens and floats them down the stairs. And of course the little notes are like her little poems. They're cryptic, nobody knows what she's saying. That kind of isolated her anyway. According to legend, a young girl comes to play the piano for her, and Emily listens to a partially open door from another room. The only people who saw her face to face were her brother and sister, her mother and father, her sister-in-law, Sue, she was very close with, Judge Otis P. Lord, who's a candidate for Emily's lover, Samuel Bowles, the editor of the local newspaper, came every day and filled Emily in on the news and all the stuff that didn't make it into the newspaper. Bowles is considered a candidate because he was a philanderer. He had a lot of mistresses. If anybody would have been able to seduce her, he was the guy who had the tools. Seducers are like child molesters. They hone right in on victims. They know them on sight, and he would have been able to get around Emily. Among other candidates are a guy named Dickinson, who wrote an essay for young poets in Atlantic magazine. Emily read the essay, sent him some of her poems. He wrote back, told her to get rid of those odd rhymes, to regularize the meter of the poems. She wrote him back and thanked him for his advice, but never followed any of it, and told him all she really wanted to know was if the poems breathed or not. Nevertheless, they corresponded for about 8 years. She only saw Dickinson Higginson face to face one time. And he comes to visit her, said she came in with 2 tulips and presented those as her calling card. She was very small and petite and cute and very full of energy. She asked him a question about himself, And he answered it briefly, and then she went off for 15 minutes talking. And he said every sentence had an idea in it that you wanted to spend an hour on. And she just rattled these ideas off, one after another. Now, she had Mabel Loomis Todd, a novelist who was a friend of hers, who she'd gone to school with. So she could talk literature with her. But a novelist isn't a poet. The techniques are completely different. The whole attitude is different. So she didn't have a poet to talk to. And finally she's got one, and all these things she's been thinking for 15 years about poetry, she just puts out on Dickinson one after another. And he writes to his wife and says, it was enjoyable, but I don't think I ever want to do it again. It was just so exhausting. The mind that this woman has, these ideas, and they're so, the way they're phrased is so cryptic and yet succinct at the same time. And there were so many of them, there's just this flood of speech. And after about 15 minutes, she'd say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've been dominating the conversation." And she'd ask him another question, and 2 minutes later, she was off on another rap for 20 minutes. Now, some people think Dickinson is a possible lover. I doubt it. Now, men, I think, like intelligent women. I mean, if looks and everything else was equal, I think most guys would say, if you had twin sisters, one dumb, one smart, they're both great looking, most guys, I think now, would take the smart one. No? I don't know. I mean, it's been so long since I've been in the real world. In Emily's day, bright women were not at a premium. A guy did not want a bright wife. Intelligence in a woman was intimidating. Well, what does intimidating do for your sexuality? If you're intimidated by somebody, is that generally a turn-on? No. And it wouldn't have been for Dickinson. I think the fact that he was intellectually intimidated by Emily, no matter how willing or unwilling Emily might have been, would have pretty much put her out of the question as far as Dickinson was concerned. One of the other candidates is a young law student who studied with her father when she was 17. She had a tendency to gravitate to men as mentors, as teachers of one kind. Not necessarily because they were brighter than her, but because they knew things that she didn't know. She didn't want to bother studying the news, so Samuel Bowles came and told her the news and filled in all the spaces and answered all her questions. She didn't want to know about the law, so Judge Bowles comes and talks to her about the law. I can't think of the name of the law student. But when her father would give her a book she wasn't supposed to read, she would ask him about it. And he would read it and tell her roughly what was in it, and if it was at all upsetting, then it would stop and she wouldn't read it. And if it wasn't, then she would go and read the book. Her withdrawal starts not long after he leaves. That's one of the reasons why he's a main candidate. From what you've gathered of Emily Dickinson's personality from her writing, do you think if she was in love with a guy living in the same house at 17, she would have crept down the hall after everybody was asleep? Or not? I think she would have. Now let's say you do that. Remember the time when virginity is the only marketable goods a woman has. And then the guy doesn't ask you to marry him when he's finished studying law, which he couldn't have done anyway. Why not? He's going to ask for the hand of the most prominent man in Amherst. You got to have at least a job before you do that. So maybe he says to Emily, "Look, I love you. I'll go away. I'll start a practice. I'll come back for you." And within a year, he marries somebody else. You might wish he was dead. And if Emily did, maybe that's the beginning of the break, because he gets pneumonia and dies. Now, you know you didn't really kill him by wishing him dead, but you still feel a huge amount of guilt about it, and that might be the beginning of the withdrawal. The withdrawal also might be because the affair is with the Reverend Charles Wadsworth, a married transcendentalist preacher who she saw preach in Philadelphia, and one of the few times she was ever out of Amherst, and who visited her 6 or 8 times at her house. Formally. The house had an orchard behind it. Emily often went out in the garden. She may have met him more times than that. And as you'll see, he's the leading candidate for clues that are in the poem. However, it's not necessarily that Emily even had an affair. For example, there might be a medical explanation for her withdrawal from the world. She might have suffered from agoraphobia, fear of open spaces. It starts with panic attacks. Suddenly you're terrified and there's no reason for it. And that happens to you in the Foodtown parking lot. So you don't go to the Foodtown parking lot anymore. Then it happens to you at the mall, so you don't go to the mall anymore. Pretty soon you're not going anywhere anymore. And then somebody knocks on the door and you have a panic attack. Now people are scary. So you withdraw completely from the world. Another possible explanation is that she suffered from Bright's disease. Now this diagnosis was made on very slim evidence. The doctor who made it only got to see her walk fully clothed past a partially open door. That would consist of his entire examination. So how good of a diagnosis he made, we don't know. But it would explain certain things. If you have Bright's disease, your kidneys stop working. When your kidneys stop working, the waste products begin to build up in your blood. When that happens, your sensorium starts to dim. Things are not as bright as they were. They're not as colorful. Your senses get muffled. And of course, the more muffled the world becomes, the more depressed you are. The more depressed you are, the more muffled the world becomes. If you take somebody who's chronically depressed and you show them the same color, say orange, vivid and just an ordinary shade of orange, they can't tell them apart. The whole vividness goes out of things. That would account for those dark kind of poems like there is a certain slant of light, winter afternoons. It oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. It's that day in January where the sun comes in at that low angle and it's Sunday and nothing's moving and everything is kind of dead and depressed. That might have been the Bright's disease. If she did have this, that preoccupation she has with death, which some scholars have attributed to her room, her bedroom, looking out on the cemetery. So there were always funerals, so she was always thinking about death. Bright's disease makes a lot better explanation. Everything builds up, and you start to pass out. You start to go into a coma. And when she writes, I heard a fly buzz when I died, it really sounds like somebody who had died or come close to dying. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room. Oh, that's something I want to point out about Emily. You notice the capitalization. It looks almost random. But what she does is she capitalizes words if she's using them metaphorically. So the fly is a fly, but it's not the only thing. She heard something, the fly stands for something. The stillness in the room isn't just the stillness, it's that quietness would come. Remember when somebody died, they held a vigil around the bed, and they waited to see if the person had stopped breathing on, to see if they had passed. And everybody around was gotten still. It was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. So she's making a metaphor here. The eye of the storm is like the silence in the room, between the fits of the death pangs and the final dying. Because she's making a poetic metaphor, she capitalizes it to call attention to it. The eyes around had wrung them dry. And of course, she's talking about people who had cried themselves out, but instead of saying people, she focuses in just on their eyes. The eyes stand for everybody in the room. And breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. Who's the king? Beside Elvis. It's God. They expect God or Christ to come down and take her soul. And so they're waiting for that presence. I willed my keepsakes. Remember when they died, they gave stuff away. Death was a very formal occasion. You gave people things. Here's this necklace. I knew you always liked it. Think about me when you wear it. Signed away, what portion of me be assignable? And then it was there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed. And then I could not see to see. That last line is just such a great line. I mean, she just said, I could not see. you get the feeling of everything having gotten dark, but I can't see to see makes it a double kind of blindness. The blindness as she passes, she thinks into death. So in other words, whenever Emily passed out, if it was Bright's disease that she had, she thought she was dying. And it was a good likelihood that she might have. Now, if you've got a fatal disease that you go into a coma from frequently, and it feels like you're dying, to be preoccupied with death isn't neurotic. You'd have to be neurotic not to be preoccupied with it. It also accounts for poems like I Taste the Liquor Never Brewed, because she doesn't die. She passes out, they take her upstairs and put her on the bed. The liver works to purify the blood when you're at rest, especially when you're asleep. So over 24 hours or over the night, by the next day, a lot of stuff's been filtered out of her blood. Her sensorium goes back. She wakes up, and first of all, she's alive when she thought she was going to be dead. Well, anytime you come close to death, the world just lights up. You get super aware of everything around you. And then secondly, she's actually seeing color more vividly, the way she would normally see it. And she's just overjoyed with life, and you get a poem like I Taste the Liquor Never Brewed, which is 214. I taste the liquor never brewed from tankards scooped in pearl. That's those big beer drinking steins from Germany, which is where Frankfurt is. Not all the Frankfurt berries yield such an alcohol. Inebriate of air am I, and debauchee of dew. What's an inebriate? A drunk. What's she drunk on? Life. She's high on life. Much as I hate to quote Nancy Reagan. She's just wrecked on being alive because she thought she was going to be dead, and everything makes her giddy and seeming drunk because she thought she was going to be dead, and everything now is so wonderful to her. She goes out into the garden which she loves, reeling through endless summer days from inns of molten blue. When landlords turn the drunken bee out of the foxglove's door, when butterflies renounce their drams, I shall but drink the more. She's comparing a bee to a drunkard. The foxglove is an inn, but it's also the landlord, because the bee goes in the foxglove and it tries to get the pollen, and the flower shakes, and then it buzzes out like it was thrown out. And then how does a bee fly? In a zigzag. How does a drunk walk? In a zigzag. So she uses that landlord in quote because she's using the foxglove doubly as a metaphor. It's both the inn that the bee gets thrown out of, and it's also the landlord that throws him out. A dram, liquor stores are called dram shops. When the butterflies get drunk on nature and give up drinking, she'll drink the more. Till seraphs swing their snowy hats and saints to windows run to see the little tippler. What's a tippler? A drunkard. From Manzanilla come, and Manzanilla was where they made the strongest rum. Now, one of the things that also where Emily is doing experimental things like Walt Whitman, where Whitman kept revising Leaves of Grass, Emily keeps revising her poems. We know they're not drafts because she wrote several versions of the same poem in a perfect hand. In other words, there were drafts that had crossovers and changes, but the ones when she was finished with them, she wrote a fine copy of it, and then she often bound them up with ribbons or she sewed them together in a little booklet. And in the booklet you'll find the same poem like this one, which in your book ends with, I think it's to see the little tippler leaning against the sun. Drunks walk like they're walking into the wind. Now that's not a variation of that poem, that's a separate poem. She saw these, even though they only differ in one line, as two completely different poems. That's something poets hadn't been doing in the past. Normally if you're a poet, you choose one or the other and that's what you publish. But you notice that something else about it is that Emily doesn't publish. In fact, her attitudes towards publishing is pretty contemptuous. Poem 709. Publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing, possibly. If you were poor and had to have money desperately, you might sell a poem for it, and maybe that would be legitimate. But we, that is she, would rather from our garret, where she wrote the poems, go white, pure, unsullied by trade, unto the white Creator, than invest our snow. Her snow is her poems, because they're pure, like the snow. Thought belonged to him who gave it. Well, who gives thought? Who gives everything? God. So the thought is God's. You can't, he gives it to you as a gift. You can't sell a gift. Then to him who bare its corporeal illustration, the idea comes from God. The person who expresses it makes it corporeal or real. Sell the royal air? How can you sell God's breath? In the parcel be the merchant of the heavenly grace, but reduce no spirit to disgrace of price. So to her, selling poems, getting published, was selling a divine gift. You remember what happens when you don't sell your poems, like Edward Taylor? You're absolutely free to write them any way you want. And that leaves Emily free. The family knew she wrote poetry. She wrote poetry for birthdays and other occasions, but nobody knew she had as many poems as she had. The whole idea of getting famous appalled her. Let me find this one. It's about the... Are you nobody? I'm nobody too.
288.
Poem 288. Is it on? It's on the handout.
First, I think so. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too?
Yes, that's the one. On the first sheet.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? You notice those dashes? Remember how Whitman put in the little printer symbols to control the voice of whoever was reading it? These dashes in her original poem are of differing lengths, and they point up, down, or neutral to indicate whether your voice should rise or fall and how long you should hold it. Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell. They'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. If Emily got famous, what would happen? People would come to Amherst. They'd walk by her house and point. They'd gather on her lawn. Guys, people would knock on the door. I read your poems. They touched me so much. I knew you were a kindred spirit and would want to talk to me. I mean, Stephen King's got big dogs that keep people out of his house. A mental patient ended up in his house once and held his wife at scissor point for a while. You become a writer, people seek you out. What would Emily think of that? A nightmare. She didn't even see anybody but the family. The idea of being public and being famous and having everybody show up was appalling to her. Next week we'll finish up the poems about whether she had love or not, and then we're going to do Hawthorne and Poe.